exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. That's what we do at Kung Fu Podcast. I'm your host, Sifu T.W. Smith. Thank you so much for joining me today in episode 74. And if you're a first-time visitor here, welcome. I hope you enjoy the program. I'd also like to say thank you to Shelton, who wrote me a little email, and he says, quote, I've never met you, obviously, but you have an almost Reagan, Henry David Thoreau way of making yourself known through your storytelling, expression, and compassionate approach. Shelton, thank you very much for taking the time to send me that note. And storytelling is something I hope I can get a lot better at. Last week I shared with you the story of a young man named Steve Baskus. He's a veteran who got blinded by a roadside bomb in Iraq, and he wants a wooden dummy to get back to his martial arts training. Now, I've spoken with his family, his friends, and Steve and I have exchanged a couple of phone calls. And I want us, you, as part of this martial arts family, to help one of our own. His fundraising website is up, and we're going to raise $1,500 to get a wooden dummy purchased and delivered for him. I'm asking you to take a moment and pause this podcast. Think about providing some assistance, whether it's donating a few dollars and or sharing his webpage with family and friends. You can go to kungfupodcast.com/help Steve, one word, help Steve, and it'll take you right to his website. Now, in just a couple of days it's been up, we've already raised $257. And like I said, if you can't donate right now, just make sure you take the time and share the page on your Facebook, Twitter accounts, things like that. The main topic for today is 4 contributing factors to corroding moral judgment. I will be referring to various research and literature today, and the first book is titled Martial Arts and Philosophy by Professor Graham Priest. He is a professor of philosophy at the City of New York. He was educated at the University of Cambridge and the London School of Economics. He is a 4th Dan in Shito-Ryu Karate. He also likes to practice Tai Chi. Now, his book has 4 out of 5 stars over at Amazon, and in the description it says martial arts and philosophy have always gone hand in hand. Philosophical argument is closely parallel with hand-to-hand combat, and all of today's Asian martial arts like karate, kung fu, judo, or aikido were developed to embody and apply philosophical ideas. Now, I downloaded and started reading the book. In the first place it says, quote, as it happens, the very beginnings of philosophy in ancient Athens were intertwined with the martial arts. Socrates was respected as a soldier. Like all citizens, he was quite literally schooled in the martial arts, the craft of battle. His courage and otherworldly calm in combat were legendary. His pupil, Plato, was a well-built grappler. Plato basically means broad-shouldered, and that was his wrestling nickname. And the combative point-for-point character of Greek philosophy had a decidedly martial mood to it, end quote. A little further down, Professor Priest writes, quote, Plato developed a conception of human life based on the notion of a kind philosopher-warrior. He was familiar with the fighting arts of the Athens of his day, and as well as the prowess of the warriors of Sparta, whom he much admired. In the Republic, Plato presents his athlete-warrior, the philosopher-king, as having developed the ideal human soul. Sadly, Plato never put his warrior-philosopher program into practice. There are no Plato dojos that I know of, but we do have a fairly clear account of what he takes the point of martial training to be. Plato spends a great deal of time in the Republic talking about the guardians, the athlete warriors who would be trained to defend his model human community, and ultimately to rule it. In fact, it's pretty clear in the Republic that the guardians represent the very ideal of human existence. While their physical training has an obvious practical, political, and military purpose, Plato emphasizes that the training of the body is the training of the soul. Plato's warriors must develop harmonious souls, where harshness is balanced with gentleness, and wisdom and rational ability are exhibited together with high-spiritedness and bravery. Plato sees martial training as a battle to cultivate moral virtues, end quote. The study of moral psychology began with the early martial artists and philosophers such as Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates. A description of a moral act is a type of behavior that refers to a deed that has either a moral or immoral consequence. A moral act refers to a gesture or an undertaking that entails free will, purity, liberty, honesty, and meaning. So now I'm going to reference a book titled Moral Judgment and Decision Making by Dr. Darcia Narvaez, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Notre Dame, and Dr. Daniel Lampsey, who is a professor and chairman at the Department of Psychology at Notre Dame. Now I'll put a link to the 265-page PDF book in the show notes and on the website. And let me share with you the first paragraph of the introduction, which sheds a light on the challenges of moral functioning and our self-identity. Quote, "There are few more pressing problems before psychological science than to account for human moral functioning. This is because moral agency is crucial to our conception of what it means to be a person. The belief in our own moral integrity is so central to our self-understanding that often we are tempted to shield it from refutation by recourse to sanitizing euphemisms and protective belts of denial, rationalization, and special pleading. Indeed, being a self is inseparable from existing in a space of moral issues. The alignment of moral integrity with our sense of self-identity might be one of those facts about ourselves that is so obvious that it hardly bears examination. It's something along the lines of a fish being the last to discover water." End quote. So let's migrate toward this moral function and how we can bias ourselves. This could apply to any of us, as an individual or as a group of martial artists in our martial arts family or association. If we don't periodically become aware of it, it can creep in. Mr. Piercarlo Valdesella wrote in his dissertation that was titled Beyond Emotion and Reason, the Social Function of Morality. Now, he wrote that for his dissertation at Northeastern University in 2008. He researched and demonstrated how hypocrisy can be a fundamental bias in moral reasoning. And he says, quote, "An individual will perceive their own transgression to be less objectionable than the same transgression enacted by another person. This hypocritical view then extends itself out to the judgment of others. However, if these others were part of your social group, you are more likely to excuse their unfair act as compared to someone else who is not in your social group." End quote. Being aware that we can bias ourselves with hypocrisy as individuals and as a social group is important. This would apply to our church, our team, or any of our close communities. Many of your martial arts classmates that you sweat with, you endure with, and rely on are part of your community. Now, I'm not implying that hypocrisy is running rampant around you. I would hope that as martial artists we are periodically checking and balancing ourselves, but being aware that it can creep in is important. Even in some of the very best of us, it can still creep in, and we're going to see that in a bit. It is up to the leadership to any community to address it, and I'll share how one martial arts program identifies and works with it today. Before I do, let's refer again to Professor Priest's book, Martial Arts and Philosophy, where he shares his experiences, and he writes, quote, "The French philosopher Michel Foucault, who lived in 1926 through 1984, was particularly good at identifying relationships of power and discipline in society. For him, the more subtle the power play, the more pervasive it was and the harder it was to get rid of or to change. Even the mere act of observation, he said, can be an expression of power and discipline, and anyone who has felt the gaze of a martial arts teacher or who has bowed before a sensei will know what Mr. Foucault means. The martial arts world is full of the use and abuse of these power dynamics. For example, the teacher who insists that the reluctant, inexperienced student must go against a much more senior student in a sparring match, or initiation rituals for belt promotions that look much more like hazing rituals than useful forms of training." End quote. The author also states that they were aware of an organization that blindfolded and then beat their candidates for black belt. So I'm going to take a moment here because I don't want to come across as being biased against or towards any sort of system. So I want to spread this kind of manure out fairly across the systems because you all know that I didn't come from a belt system. But that doesn't mean these subtle power plays don't happen in the world of the non-belt Kung Fu martial arts either. You can go through several of these podcasts and hear me point out various issues that I've ran across. Some guy wakes up one day and decides he is a Grand Master, and that now everyone in his politically oriented association can only stay in good merit based on his whim, or that he has decided you're supposed to get down on a knee and worship him like a god because he has appointed himself. That is manure. If you're doing that, stop it. And if you're a student being exposed to that, I would really encourage you to go somewhere else. So what is the relationship between martial arts, power, and moral judgment? Kung Fu Podcast is all about the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. But what if the culture of a program is abusive? How does it impact us? How does the act of martial arts impact us with opportunities to shape ourselves differently, physically, mentally, and emotionally? How about biochemically? When you exercise and train, biochemical changes occur. And if performed regularly enough, you can actually alter your hormone balance. And now you're changing yourself at a very cellular level. Could that affect how you function morally? Well, let's take a peek by looking at a group that generally has a high level of testosterone, an extremely high level of community and family, very high standards of conduct, and martially trained as a way of living, the U.S. Marine Corps. Jay Sadlik, Department of Health, Sport and Exercise Science at the University of Kansas, published a study in 2015 titled Immunoendocrine Alterations Following Marine Corps Martial Arts Training are Associated with Changes in Moral Cognitive Processes. If you'd like more details on the Marine Corps Martial Arts Program, you can go to kungfupodcast.com/26, and I did a whole episode just on it. Sadlik writes that combined physical and psychological stress events have been associated with exacerbated endocrine responses and increased alterations in immune cell trafficking when compared to exercise stress alone. Military training programs are rigorous in nature and are often purposely delivered in environments combining both high levels of physical and mental stress. The objective of this study was to assess physiological and cognitive changes following U.S. Marine martial arts training. Active duty male Marines were observed during a typical Marine Corps martial arts training session. Biochemically, they traced a protein group called cytokines. They play a major role in the adaptive immune system. Cytokines are currently being used clinically as a biological response modifier for the treatment of various disorders. These proteins, other immune parameters, and hormone concentrations were determined from blood samples obtained at the baseline, immediately post-training, and every 15 minutes for up to an hour after the training session. The data demonstrates that the Marine Corps Martial Arts Training Program induces significant alterations in lymphocyte and leukocyte distributions, but does not shift the balance of cytokines or induce a systemic inflammatory response. Now, this research emphasis on immune system responses and systemic inflammation to strenuous exercise has been a focus point since the year 2000. Of course, if the Marine Corps is doing something that may be putting their men at increased risk of infection, they want to know about it so that they can account for it and counter it if possible. They did find, however, that the martial arts program does, quote, induce alterations in moral decision-making ability associated with the observed endocrine responses, even suggesting a potential interaction between one's social identity and endocrine responses upon moral decision-making, end quote. Similar biochemical changes and moral judgment changes have been published by Kay Stark, Department of General Psychology at the University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany, where they studied moral decision-making and found an association between the individual's cortisol stress response and egoistic decision-making in highly emotional situations. Professor Stark says, quote, we tested the role of testosterone in moral decision-making. We predicted and found that individuals high in testosterone are more likely to make utilitarian decisions, specifically when doing so involves acts of aggression and social cost, end quote. Testosterone is associated with utilitarian behavior. All right, so you got young men, they're vigorously active, hopefully eating smart, eating their Wheaties, getting their rest, avoiding being in knuckleheaded situations. Now, that could be a Marine or that could be a martial artist. Utilitarian is defined as being designed to be useful or practical rather than attractive. So synonyms like practical, functional, pragmatic, serviceable, sensible, and efficient. That doesn't sound anything wrong with that. But what does that mean when it comes to moral functioning? Let's review a research paper from Columbia University titled Moral Decisions and Testosterone, When the Ends Justify the Means, written by Dana Carney and Malaya Mason. They wrote, quote, "We hypothesize that unbending utilitarians in a moral decision-making context are those who would prioritize the outcome, regardless of the potentially aversive process through which the outcome was reached, would have higher basal testosterone than other types of decision makers." They used what is called the trolley problem, and in moral philosophy it includes a pair of decision-making dilemmas. The first is called the switch, and the second is called the footbridge, and it's suited to test different possibilities. In the switch version, people generally advocate choosing to flip a switch that will divert this trolley to a track where only one person gets stuck, and especially if that action prevents the trolley from killing 5 people stuck on the original track. When posed with a nearly identical dilemma in the footbridge version, where they have to sacrifice one life in exchange for 5, the majority of people cease being utilitarian. They are unwilling to endure the emotional, physiological, and social consequences of endorsing the pushing of a man off of a footbridge to block the trolley from killing 5 people stuck on the track, even though from a utilitarian decision-making standpoint, the two scenarios are equivalent. As we consider moral judgment and development, Tom Creeley was regimental Marine chaplain from 1999 to 2001, and he states, quote, "For nearly 229 years, the Marine Corps has valiantly defended our nation with sound moral values. As a Navy chaplain to the Marines, I am proud to have served along their side," end quote. But some time ago he discovered and wrote about a problem that since then the Marine Corps has made adjustments to counter and to correct. The article he wrote was about identifying problems when making moral decisions that was associated with the drill instructors as they were training recruits. There are 4 identifiable interlocking contributors to the corrosive and obstructive moral deficit, he writes. Examining them will better explain the dynamics associated with defaulting on moral leadership. It will also point out how the problem might be effectively addressed. The first contributing problem is power. When someone gets power over another, commanding control, those people who come from an abusive background now feel empowered to do the same to those they have power over. They lack the intrinsic values of self-respect and dignity for their fellow human beings. As a leader, it is important to be cognizant of behavior that demonstrates the propensity to go over the edge. The second contributing factor, many young people grow up without the ability to set a boundary. If young people do not have the ability to set boundaries, there will be injudicious use of power. Boundaries enable a person to maintain control over their own actions with thought and reflection and control of self-serving desires. A lack of boundaries between people leads to unhealthy relationships. Boundaries are the early warning system not to go beyond defensible moral limits. The third contributing factor to a moral deficit is not having emotional intelligence. It leads to poor leadership skills that then leads to abuse. A crisis results when emotions control us instead of us controlling our emotions. Self-awareness and self-management skills are crucial for motivating others. Strict discipline is not a substitute for emotional intelligence. One must learn to lead oneself before attempting to lead others. And then fourth, not having a framework for making moral decisions. Growing up and living in a society with conflicting values plays havoc with moral reasoning. Peer pressure, groupthink, and personal agendas override the virtue of character if it is not reinforced. Having a moral basis upon which to determine right and wrong behavior and from which to question motives provides for sound leadership. Ethics are prescriptive to life events. Drill instructors who utilize a solid framework for making moral decisions will exhibit behavior that fortifies the Marine Corps values of honor, courage, and commitment. He writes, quote, "A Marine accepts an awesome responsibility to live up to the drill instructor's creed, which is recited at drill instructor school graduation at the leadership introduction to every new platoon of recruits. The drill instructor's creed states, 'These are my recruits. I will train them to the best of my ability. I will develop them into smartly disciplined, physically fit, basically trained Marines, thoroughly indoctrinated in love of Corps and country. I will demand of them and demonstrate by my own example the highest standards of personal conduct, morality, and professional skill." End quote. So the Marine Corps chaplain wrote about factors he observed that could and did occasionally lead to the breakdown of good moral judgment in a few drill instructors. Since then, the Marine Corps has made adjustments in their system that helps the drill instructors better take care of their new recruits. So who is the leadership of your martial arts community? Who would be representative of the drill instructor? Do the brown belts, for example, teach the white belts? If they do they do so unsupervised? If they are supervised, are any of the four factors being respectful while in a position of power, demonstrating emotional intelligence, exercising the ability to set boundaries, and presenting that they have the framework to make a good moral decision, are they being looked for? Let's reflect for a moment from the passage from Professor Priest's book again. The martial arts world is full of use and abuse of these power dynamics. The teacher who insists that the reluctant, inexperienced student must go against a much more senior student in a sparring match, or initiation rituals for belt promotions that look much more like hazing rituals than useful forms of training. So we know that the power and the rank and the authority is sometimes abused, not just in the military, but in martial arts as well. Well, how does the Marine Corps ethos handle that? Captain Jameson Yee wrote an essay, and he says that the martial arts program continuously challenges Marines physically and mentally while testing and building ethical and moral character by compelling decision-making under stressful and punishing circumstances while choosing situation-appropriate force options. As a result, the martial art program ingrains a bias for taking initiative before the enemy does and shaping the field by actions that creates opportunities to exploit an enemy's critical vulnerabilities. The Marine Martial Arts Program is a 5-belt system that has 3 formal components: physical discipline, mental discipline, and character discipline. At each level, they're evaluated in all 3 disciplines, and one builds upon the next. And in character building, it is hopefully guiding that Marine to a high level of moral judgment and leadership. Captain Yee writes, quote, "To train a large group of people to kill while ignoring the ethical and character aspects of such conduct is to create an unruly, dangerous mob. The ethical and character development component is therefore imperative for creating a disciplined, capable, and professional force." The martial art program aims to develop self-discipline and self-control, to restrain oneself in the heat of the moment, and to use force responsibly. Developing the warrior ethos includes mentoring values and shaping a long-term individual commitment to the Marine Corps and the value it represents. These activities are designed to instill an ethical dimension that places individual achievement in the context of continuing an old, honorable warrior tradition. In his essay, he goes on to write about how the Marines do that through ceremonies, educational activities, mentoring programs, and an emphasis on common heritage and respect for other customs, courtesies, and traditions. So as I'm bringing this toward the close, we have heard stories of martial arts practitioners who get into altercations. When they get the upper hand and can escape, they don't. They elect to use abuse and have been arrested for assault and murder when they could have escaped or could have just stood down. If you're listening to this program, and especially if you've made it this far into this episode, I know this about you right now. You're a martial artist or a martial art enthusiast. You have a deep philosophical interest in your craft. You have a conscience that guides you to do the best you can. You usually recognize when you've made a judgment error or could have made a different decision. You have compassion for others to treat them respectfully. Now, I also hope that you have a deep internal respect for yourself and expect others to respect you. I can say that because if you're listening to this and you've gone this far, I immediately have a respect for you. Practicing martial arts can bring out changes in your judgment as we go through that training, particularly when you are practicing intensely and applying applications. The intensity stimulates the release of many hormones and affects our emotions. Being aware of that can create you an opportunity to practice respect for one another at the most critical time, immediately and shortly after those sessions. If you're an instructor of a martial arts school, then you are the leadership of that martial arts community. Whether it's 5 people or 500 people, you are it. Do you have a creed, for example, to help the leadership and instructors remind themselves of maintaining a high level of judgment? What if you took the drill instructor's creed and adjusted it for yourself and it says something like, "These are my students. I will train them to the best of my ability. I will develop them into smartly disciplined, physically fit, basically trained martial artists, thoroughly indoctrinated in love of family and community. I will demand of them and demonstrate by my own example the highest standards of personal conduct, morality, and professional skill." So here we are coming to the end of this particular episode and of the year 2015. I've made a request of any martial artist listening to this podcast to consider getting themselves trained in first aid, because you may not be there when the mess happens, but you may be there during the aftermath and you could be of a help. Now I'm asking you of a few more things. Have an impact on a young man's life by helping him get back into the martial arts. Go to kungfupodcast.com/help-Steve and donate what you can or share his cause with family and friends. Be aware of the 4 conflicts of good moral judgment as you regularly practice in the martial arts. Be aware of the context of which it can happen as your leadership and instructional authorities are being dispensed throughout the school. And lastly, if you witness an unjust act, especially to an underling, and you say nothing, you're condoning that behavior. So reach deep, find some courage, get that underling out of there, or get into a position to intercede. But try your best to make something change. Exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. Thank you so much for joining me today in episode 74. I wish you the very, very best in your training as an individual and as your martial arts family continues to develop.